Surveillance cameras captured her on the night of July 12, 2024. A woman was rolling a large black suitcase along Komsomolsky Avenue in Perm, and from the outside, it looked completely ordinary. A summer night, around 2 o'clock, someone heading to the station or the airport. Nothing unusual. It was only later, when it became known what was inside that suitcase, that everyone would begin rewatching these frames over and over, trying to understand one thing. How a woman, whom neighbors and acquaintances described as calm and pleasant to talk to, could walk so steadily and measuredly through the night city with what she was carrying. The cameras switched one after another, recording her route. She had left the Motovilika district and was now crossing the center on foot with a heavy suitcase, without stopping or looking back. Intersection after intersection, entering the frame, exiting the frame, appearing on the next recording. Her face was motionless, her gaze directed forward. Not once did she take out her phone. Not once did she fix her hair. Not once did she slow her pace. She just walked. And in this monotony, there was something that everyone who watched these recordings would later note. At some point, she turned toward the Kommunalny Bridge. There is a railing there, and the cameras show her approaching it with a suitcase, stopping and looking down. She stood there for a few seconds. Then she turned around and walked on, as if she had changed her mind or had not originally intended to do anything right there. The next point was Monastiskaya Street, a residential courtyard, trash containers. She rolled the suitcase to a bin, carefully placed it next to it, let go of the handle, and left. There was no fuss, no glancing around. She didn't even quicken her pace after leaving it there. She walked toward the embankment at the same steady tempo, with the same stony expression on her face. The cameras continued to record her for several more hours. She wandered around the city center without any apparent purpose, sometimes sitting on a bench, then walking somewhere again. Dawn broke around 4. The city was still empty. And somewhere in the area of a hotel on the outskirts of Motovilika, she disappeared from the recordings, and the suitcase remained standing by the containers. In the summer of 2024, these frames would be broadcast on all federal channels, and millions of people would look at the woman rolling a suitcase through nighttime Perm. The answer to the question of what was inside would come just a few hours later, when it was opened. Around 4 in the morning, that same day, a man of no fixed abode was making his rounds of the container site near House 93B on Monastyrskaya Street in search of something useful. In the summer, people throw away a lot of things, and for him, it was common practice to check the bins early in the morning before the street cleaners started their shift. Next to one of the containers, he noticed a black suitcase on wheels, a large one, the kind usually taken on long trips. He approached, opened the lid, and immediately closed it back. Inside lay someone very small, looking to be 6 or 7 years old. A pillow had been neatly placed under the head, as if someone had specifically taken care to make him comfortable. It was this detail that would later feature in all the case materials and cause the investigators the most questions. The homeless man did not touch anything. He stepped aside and called the police. By 6 in the morning, the courtyard was completely cordoned off. Investigators, forensic experts, operatives, the whole procedure that is launched in such cases. Cordon tape around the perimeter, medical gloves on the asphalt. people in uniform recording things and talking among themselves. Residents of nearby houses began leaving for work and stumbled upon the cordon, not understanding what had happened. By 7 in the morning, investigators were already going through the entrances with photographs. They showed the pictures and asked, "Do you know him? Have you ever seen him? Maybe he played in the yard or lived with someone local." But no one recognized him, neither the one they found nor the woman from the surveillance cameras. To everyone, they were absolute strangers who had never been seen here before. By 10 in the morning, the photographs were sent to all the schools in Perm. Principals, head teachers, and class teachers reviewed the pictures, but the result was the same. No one identified him. And this already looked truly strange. He appeared to be 7 or 8 years old, which meant he should have been studying somewhere, should have been registered at a clinic, should have appeared somewhere and been recorded in the system. But no one knew him, and he was not enrolled in any educational institution in the city. By noon, the investigative committee released an official description of the woman from the camera footage. Fair hair, thin build, appearing 35 to 40 years old. They asked everyone with any information to contact the provided number. In parallel, forensic experts continued to work at the scene. They recorded injuries and established the circumstances and cause of death. Initial data pointed to asphyxia, signs of neck compression, as well as multiple wounds inflicted afterward. But the main question at that moment remained open. Who was he? Where did he come from? And why, with all the work of the system, had no one reported his disappearance? Not a single report, not a single notice, not a single concerned family. It was as if he didn't exist at all. Investigators faced a problem they completely did not expect. No one was looking for the person found in the suitcase. Not a single missing person report in all those hours. Not a single call from relatives. Not a single worried neighbor who would say, "Where, exactly, is the son of such and such woman from our entrance?" The 9-year-old, and as it would turn out later, he was exactly 9, seemed not to exist for this city. Photographs were sent to all schools in Perm, and principals showed them to teachers, and teachers showed them to classes. But the result remained unchanged. No one recognized him. Then they began to check databases more thoroughly, and that was when something truly strange was discovered. He was not enrolled in any educational institution at all. Not in a state school, not in a private one, not even in official homeschooling, which implies affiliation with an educational institution, regular monitoring, and mandatory assessments. There was nothing like that here. No school knew of him, and the education system simply did not see him. The investigator handling the case later explained the fundamental difference to journalists. Homeschooling is when someone studies at home, but remains within the state's field of vision, takes exams, and receives grades. Here, the state saw nothing. He simply fell out of all registries after he finished attending a preschool institution, and since then, he had not officially appeared anywhere. He attended preschool until 2019. This was established through documents. Then his mother took him out and decided to teach him herself. But she did so without any registration, without reporting to the educational authorities, and without external control. From that moment on, for all official structures, he ceased to exist. Neighbors in the house in the Motovelica district practically never noticed him. He didn't play in the yard, he had no friends, and he spent most of his time inside the apartment. Relatives later told the investigation that he was well developed for his age, spoke well, and was able to formulate thoughts and reason. But at the same time, he barely knew any peers, and the social skills that are usually formed through interaction with other people were practically non-existent in him. The only person he communicated with regularly, besides his mother, was his father. After the divorce in 2022, he lived separately, but continued to visit, walked with his son, and spent time with him. These were, in fact, the only outings into the outside world that he had. All the rest of his life was confined to one person, his mother. She decided what he would learn and to what extent. She decided whom he would see and if he would see anyone at all. She decided whether he would go outside today or stay at home. And when she disappeared with the suitcase on the night of July 12th, no one in the city even noticed that he was no longer there. Because for the city, he didn't exist anyway. Surveillance cameras in Perm operate around the clock, and hundreds of capture points are located throughout the city, recording everything that happens on the streets. The investigation began to unravel these recordings from the night of July 12th, and gradually, the full route of the woman with the suitcase was built before them. She was caught by lenses dozens of times in different parts of the city: October Square, Komsomolsky Avenue, Community Bridge, Monastyrskaya Street, the Embankment. She walked through the entire center of Perm on foot, and every step she took, every turn, every stop, all of it remained captured on the recordings. On July 12th, before noon, the video of the woman and the suitcase was released to the public. Investigators were counting on help from the community, hoping that some resident would recognize her face and report who she was and where she could be found. The calculation proved correct. She was indeed recognized. On July 13th, an official wanted notice was released with a more precise description. Fair-haired, thin build, appearing 35 to 40 years old. Wanted on suspicion of committing a case with particularly grave consequences. By then, her photograph and the camera footage had spread through all local social media groups and news channels, and finding her became a matter of time. By the evening of that same day, she was found. Irina Shatova, 34 years old. She was hiding in the attic of the Zhemchuzhina hotel in the Motovilika district. And notably, in this very building, she rented office space for her trading firm. That is, she was hiding literally in a place she knew well, and where she felt relatively safe. For almost 2 days after that night, she moved around the city, changed her clothes, and tried not to be seen. In the footage later published in the media, it was visible that her sweater was turned inside out, obviously to change her appearance at least minimally. But the cameras caught her nonetheless, and the trail she left became increasingly distinct. During the arrest, she offered no resistance. At the first interrogation, she behaved calmly and answered questions without visible emotion. The only thing she asked for was to inform her parents of her arrest. It was then that investigators began to verify the data in more detail. They checked the address of the apartment in Motovilika, from which she had emerged with a suitcase that night. They pulled documents, established the family composition, and found out who was registered at that address. And when all the information came together, it became clear who the 9-year-old found near the trash containers on Monastyrskaya was to her. Irina Shatova was his mother, the woman who had walked on foot through the entire city that night with a suitcase on wheels, who had stopped on the Komunalny bridge, looked down through the railing, and stood there for a few seconds before moving on, who then carefully placed the suitcase by the containers, let go of the handle, and walked towards the embankment with that same stony expression that all the cameras had captured. This was the mother. And from that moment on, the case took on a completely different character, because now the investigation had to find out not only what had happened, but how such a thing could happen at all. The first thing that struck investigators when they began to assemble Irina Shatova's biography was the total mismatch with the image captured by the surveillance cameras. The woman with the stony face, who rolled the suitcase through the nighttime city, and the one described by relatives, neighbors, and acquaintances, seemed to be two completely different people. Irina was born on April 12, 1990, in Perm, in the Motovilika district. She grew up in a two-parent family where everything was quite stable and prosperous. Her father worked in the traffic police all his life and retired with the rank of lieutenant colonel. Her mother was a housewife, taking care of the home and upbringing. Besides Irina, there were two other sons in the family. One now lives in Sochi, the other in Moscow. In other words, an ordinary family without any visible problems or deviations from the norm. At school, Irina attended a gymnasium and, according to those who knew her, was especially strong in the exact sciences. After finishing school, she entered Perm Polytechnic University in the Faculty of Applied Mathematics. She was serious about her studies there, wrote scientific papers, and professors noted her abilities. However, whether she ultimately received a diploma is not known for certain even by her own parents. This point remained unclarified. When questioned, neighbors characterized Irina exclusively in a positive light. They said she was never noticed in any scandals or conflicts with those around her. She gave the impression of a soft, intelligent woman who rarely raised her voice and always behaved correctly. No one who lived nearby could recall a single instance where she caused any suspicion or alarm. Acquaintances added another important detail to this portrait. Irina always helped everyone, especially her loved ones. When her parents needed help with their health, she was there without question. Her mother had joint surgery, and Irina nursed her after the operation, staying with her constantly. Her father had oncology surgery, and she cared for him, spoon-fed him, and made sure he took all his medications on time. At the trial, her mother would say a phrase that would later be frequently quoted: "My only hope was my daughter. She is kind. She never crossed us. She always did as she should." At the same time, Irina's family was never registered with social services. Over the years, there was not a single signal, not a single alarm bell from neighbors or any services, not a single police encounter, not a single complaint from anyone. From a formal point of view, it was an absolutely prosperous cell of society. Acquaintances also claimed that Irina doted on her son and tried to give him, as she herself put it, everything the best. On social media, she had built a practically perfect picture of life. Photos in stylish clothes, stories of business success, posts about self-development and achievements. From the outside, she looked like a successful modern woman who handled everything herself and remained a caring mother and daughter. a caring daughter, a loving mother, educated, calm, without a single problem in her biography. And here was this same woman on the surveillance camera recordings on the night of July 12th, with a suitcase on wheels, with that same stony expression that didn't change for a second during her entire journey through the city. The two images categorically did not match, and the investigation had to figure out which one was real and which was merely a carefully constructed mask. On the morning of July 13th, Irina's parents were at their dacha near Perm, and for them, the day began as an ordinary summer weekend. Only the day before, the 12th, everything had been completely normal. Irina had visited them with her son. They spent time in the fresh air, and her father took them both for a boat ride on the river. Then, toward evening, he drove his daughter and grandson back to the city, to their apartment in Motovilicha, and returned to the dacha. Nothing unusual happened that day. No alarm signals, no oddities in his daughter's behavior that might have raised suspicion. And then, on the morning of the 13th, they turned on the television. On the screen were frames from surveillance cameras. A woman with a large black suitcase walking through the night city. Perm was searching for her identity in connection with the discovery on Monastyrskaya. The police asked everyone who might know anything about this woman to come forward. Her mother recognized her first. It took her only a few seconds to understand who exactly was depicted in those recordings. My wife screamed, "It's Irina," and collapsed. The father would later tell journalists, recalling that moment. They couldn't believe it. They immediately grabbed the phone and dialed their daughter's number. It rang, but no one picked up. They called again, then again, and each time there was the same silence in response. The phone was on, but Irina didn't answer, and with every passing minute, the parents' anxiety grew stronger. The father later recounted in an interview how he survived those first days. "I barely came to my senses. I lost about 8 kilograms in a week." And this was said by a man who had served in the system his entire life, had seen various things, and was used to keeping himself in check. No, here it was about his own daughter and his grandson, and no professional experience could prepare him for such a thing. In the first hours after they saw the footage, the parents were absolutely certain that Irina was already gone, that she had done what she did and then followed after because she couldn't live with it. For them, it was the only logic that fit in their heads and explained anything at all. My wife and I understood. After doing such a thing to her son, she definitely ended her own journey. She is honest. She was always decent throughout her life. She didn't deceive anyone, the father said, and he repeated the word decent several times in different interviews, as if trying to explain to both himself and others how such a thing could happen to a person he had known her whole life. For the parents, the picture was built exactly like that. Their daughter had done something terrible and irreparable, and then couldn't exist further. It was monstrous, but at least understandable from some human perspective. But Irina was alive. At the very moment when her parents sat at the dacha in front of the TV trying to call her, she was on the technical floor of the Žemčužina Hotel in Motovilicha, just a few kilometers away from them. She had been hiding there for 2 days, changing her clothes, trying not to be seen, and at the same time, she perfectly understood that they were looking for her. On the evening of that same day, July 13th, she was detained. And then the parents had to face another blow. Their daughter had not only committed what she was suspected of, but after that, she had hidden from the police for almost 2 days instead of surrendering or ending her journey, as they had assumed. This fact fit their understanding of her even less than everything else. On July 13th, toward evening, Irina Shatova was brought for her first interrogation at the investigative committee. Later, the agency published a fragment of a video recording from this interrogation, and the people who watched it noted the same thing. She was absolutely calm. No visible emotion, no panic, no tears, or attempts to explain anything. The same stony expression that the surveillance cameras captured on the night she walked through the city with a suitcase. The only thing she asked the investigators was to inform her parents of her detention so they would know she was alive. On July 14th, she was officially charged. The wording was as follows. On the night of July 11th to July 12th, she caused injuries incompatible with life to her 9-year-old son through compression of the neck, after which she inflicted multiple stab wounds. She then placed him in a suitcase and left it by the trash containers on Monastyrskaya Street. At this stage, Shatova did not admit guilt. She listened to the charges but did not confirm them and gave no testimony on the merits. And then, on July 15th, everything changed. She herself, on her own initiative, filed a confession. She fully admitted what she was accused of and told the investigators in detail exactly how everything had happened that night. Her testimony was so detailed and consistent that the investigation had no doubts about its reliability. According to her, that evening her son was sitting in the room watching cartoons. She took a phone charging cable, approached him from behind, threw it around his neck, and tightened the loop. He tried to resist, but she held the cable for about a minute, until he stopped moving. After it was all over, she took a knife and inflicted the blows. According to the forensic medical report, there were at least 35 such blows. And this is important to understand. All these wounds were inflicted after the end had already occurred. That is, the cause was asphyxia from neck compression, and the stab wounds appeared later and were not related to the immediate cause. The investigator who handled the case, Gleb Vedernikov, would later say in an interview a phrase that surprised many. There was no cold-blooded calculation in her actions. This sounded strange against the backdrop of what she did and the camera footage where she walks through the city with an absolutely motionless face. But the investigator meant something else. She did not try to build some defensive version, did not blame someone else for what happened, and did not invent circumstances that could mitigate her position. Shatova simply told everything as it was, calmly, consistently, without emotion, as if she were retelling a story that happened to someone else and not to herself. And it was precisely this detachment in her behavior that raised the most questions for everyone present at the interrogations. Because it is one thing to commit what she committed, and quite another to talk about it like this, without the slightest sign of remorse or even an understanding of the scale of what had happened. From that moment, the investigation moved to a new stage. Now it was necessary to understand not only what exactly happened that night, but also why it could have happened at all. What drove this woman, whom everyone around characterized as a calm, educated, and caring mother, to such an end? In her social networks, Irina Shatova had built a picture that did not cause the slightest suspicion. And it was this discrepancy between what she showed the world and what was actually happening that would become one of the key details in understanding this whole story. On her pages, everything looked flawless. Fitness workouts, striking selfies in stylish clothes, stories about business successes, and how she was building her life. The image of a successful modern woman who handles everything herself, controls the situation, raises a son, and earns enough to not depend on anyone. What exactly was she doing? Trading. She bought shares of various enterprises, waited for them to grow in price, and then sold them. The difference between the purchase and sale constituted her earnings. The scheme itself was quite legal and simple enough to understand. The only thing was that she wasn't trading with her own funds, but with other people's. And that was where the part of the story began that eventually led to catastrophe. Irina took money from clients under the promise of paying them 6% monthly on top of the invested amount. At first, everything worked exactly as she promised. Payments were made regularly, without delays. Clients were happy and recommended her to their acquaintances. 6% a month is a lot. It is significantly more than any bank deposit can offer, and people eagerly brought her their savings. The idea to go into trading originally belonged to Irina herself. Her husband, Sergei, helped in another way. He looked for investors among his wealthy acquaintances and colleagues, finding people who were ready to invest money under such conditions. And at first, everything really went well. The mechanism worked, and no one suspected that at some point the situation would start to spiral out of control. During the investigation, Irina said that at a certain point she wanted to stop. She understood that the risks were growing, that the market was unpredictable, and that it was becoming increasingly difficult to continue. But the clients themselves came to her and asked her not to stop. They needed those 6%, that stable monthly income they had already built into their financial plans. And she continued, although by all appearances, she already understood where it could lead. In a court hearing, one of the creditors recalled that shortly before those events, he saw Irina in person and immediately noticed that something was wrong with her. She had lost a terrible amount of weight, looked exhausted, and it was obvious from her whole appearance that she was in a state of extreme stress. He even offered her an option to pay off the debt in parts, to stretch the payments over several years, to come to some human agreement. No, Irina remained silent. She told no one how bad things really were and continued to maintain that perfect image, even though there was nothing behind it anymore. The only person she said anything to about her state was her new man, Arthur, who also worked in trading and understood the specifics of the field. On the eve of that fateful evening, she sent him a message that would later appear in the case materials. If something happens to me, these people will be to blame. She meant the creditors, those to whom she owed money, and from whom, according to her feelings, a threat emanated. Arthur later testified in court and said that he tried to calm her down. He told her, any problem can be solved. No one is going to persecute anyone over debts. You can always sit down and come to an agreement. He was sure that the situation, though difficult, was not hopeless, that there were options, there was time, there was a way to somehow resolve it. But Irina did not reach an agreement, and she didn't try. Instead, on the night of July 12th, she did what she did and left the house with a suitcase. The mechanics of what occurred that night were already known to the investigation. A charging cable, about a minute of neck compression, then stabs with a knife. Irina told all of this herself, and experts confirmed her testimony. But one detail gave no peace to the investigators, or to those who later studied the case materials. Forensic medical experts counted at least 35 stab wounds. They were all concentrated in the chest area, and all without exception were inflicted after the end had already occurred. The prosecutor read this conclusion in court. By the time of the blows, the son was no longer breathing. That is, these injuries had no practical purpose. And here a question arose that no one could answer. Why? Shatova herself said during interrogation, "I struck 3 times, as it seemed to me." 3 and 35 are incompatible numbers. Either she intentionally underestimated the count, or she really didn't remember, or at that moment, she was no longer herself. The investigation checked the first version, but it was not confirmed. Shatova did not try to hide details, did not build a defense line, and did not evade questions. She simply did not remember how many times she brought down the knife. Psychotherapist Nikolai Strelkov, who was later asked to comment on the case, explained, "Under extreme stress, the human psyche regresses. When a person cannot cope on an adult level, they switch to primitive mechanisms. Destroy the source of the problem, destroy the world, destroy oneself." But not a single version answered the main questions. If it was rage, why did the neighbors not hear a sound? If it was psychosis, why did she then calmly pack her things and leave? If it was an attempt to be certain, why 35 and not 5? Experts differed in their assessments. Some spoke of dissociation, a state where consciousness shuts off and a person acts automatically. Others leaned towards the version of affect, a total loss of control. Still others suggested ritualistic behavior, a symbolic completion of some internal process. No version was ever confirmed. Only the fact remained: 35 blows to an already motionless find. And a woman who sincerely believed there were 3. The investigation recorded one detail that did not fit into any logic and did not belong to any of the proposed versions of what happened. When the homeless man opened the suitcase that night near the containers on Monastyrskaya, he saw a pillow lay under the head, an ordinary household pillow, carefully placed so that it would be comfortable. The source 59th Rue conveyed the words of the investigators working on the case. She placed the pillow out of care. And this combination, 35 knife blows and a pillow under the head, did not fit in the mind of anyone who read the materials. It simply didn't connect. Cold-bloodedness does not pair with tenderness. Rage leaves no room for such gestures, because a person in a state of affect does not think about comfort. If it was calculation, why the pillow at all? What was the practical point? And if it was care, how did it combine with what happened before? During the investigative experiment, Shatova demonstrated her actions on a mannequin. She did it calmly, methodically, without visible emotion, explaining every step. According to her, after the neck compression, she doubted whether the end had set in permanently. That was why she took the knife. She thought she had struck 3 blows, but it turned out there were 35. Then she carefully placed him in the suitcase. Then the pillow. In its conclusion, The prosecutor's office used a phrasing that would later be quoted in all materials about the case. She acted out of a sense of false compassion. In Shatova's own testimony, the word altruistic appeared in relation to the motive for what she committed. She called it a kind of care, and by all appearances, sincerely believed so. For any person from the outside, this sounded like absurdity, or like a manifestation of madness, or like a third thing for which no name yet existed in familiar categories. However, the psychiatric evaluation found her completely sane. Experts concluded that she understood what she was doing, realized the consequences of her actions, and was capable of directing them. That is, from a medical point of view, it was not psychosis, not a disorder that would deprive her of the ability to answer for her actions. And yet, the pillow, a carefully placed pillow in the suitcase. Investigator Gleb Vedernikov would later say a phrase to journalists that perhaps explained more than all the evaluations combined. Irina called her son part of herself, not a separate person with his own life, his own desires, and his own future, a part of her very self. And perhaps that was the answer to the question about the pillow. Not an action toward another person, but the destruction of a part of herself. With the same strange care with which a person sometimes prepares themselves for their own independent departure from life, putting affairs in order, laying out things. But this was only a theory, one of many. To prove it was impossible, just as it was impossible to look into the head of the woman who walked through the city that night with a suitcase and a stony face. The investigation pieced together the picture of the 9-year-old's life bit by bit, and with every new interrogation, every new testimony, this picture became more closed and more alarming. There had been no school since 2019. The mother had arranged for homeschooling and taught him all the subjects herself. No educational institutions, no sports clubs, no hobby groups where he could interact with peers. According to the documents, everything was filed correctly. Formally, no violations existed. But in essence, it was total isolation from the outside world. There were no friends either. When investigators began to compile a list of those who knew him personally and could testify, they were met with a void. Not a single name except for immediate relatives. Not a single phone number in the contacts belonging to a peer. Not a single person who could say, "Yes, we were friends. We played together. I knew him." Irina's father said a phrase during interrogation that would later be frequently quoted. "He was difficult. He couldn't have lived with us. He was attached to his mother." Shatova's mother spoke at the trial about an extraordinary attachment between the daughter and the son, though what exactly she meant by those words remained not entirely clear. Psychotherapist Nikolai Strelkov, commenting on the case for journalists, explained the mechanism of what happened from the perspective of developmental psychology. According to him, normal separation from the mother begins at age 2 or 3, when the understanding of oneself as a separate individual is formed. Here, that didn't happen. By age 9, he had still not psychologically separated from his mother, had not formed his own boundaries, and had not built his own separate world. And so his entire world was effectively limited to the apartment in Motovilika. His entire circle of communication was closed around one person, his mother. His entire life flowed within her orbit, according to her rules, at her rhythm. Neighbors in the building, when questioned, remembered occasionally seeing them together, on the courtyard playground, grocery shopping at the store, walking around the neighborhood. He always stayed close to her, quiet, calm, inconspicuous. None of the neighbors could recall his voice, because he practically never spoke to strangers. Investigator Gleb Vedenikov would later tell journalists what had already been stated in the case files. Irina called her son a part of herself, not a separate person with his own life and his own future, but a part of herself, a continuation of her own existence. On the eve of that evening, during the afternoon of July 12th, the grandfather took them both out on a boat, Irina and his grandson. An ordinary summer day at the Dacha, nothing alarming, no signals of what was to come. In the evening, they drove back to the city, and the grandmother was still texting her daughter, asking how the drive was and if everything was all right. Irina replied calmly, as usual. The next morning, it was all over. He lived for 9 years, and all those 9 years were in a world entirely created for him by his mother. She was his only anchor, the only truly close person, the only one he knew more than superficially. And she was also the only one who decided it was time for him to go. At the trial, Irina's mother spoke about her daughter not as a defendant, but as the person she had known throughout her entire life. From this testimony, a portrait gradually emerged of a woman who was used to carrying everything on her own shoulders and never asked for help. When her parents were ill, Irina nursed them herself. She helped with treatment, cared for them after surgeries, and spoon-fed them when necessary. She has 2 brothers, one living in Sochi and the other in Moscow. But for some reason, it was she who took on all the care for their parents. They later moved to the Dacha and went to stay with their son in Sochi during the winter. But whenever the need arose, the daughter was always there and never refused. She also raised her son virtually alone. The divorce from Sergei was officially finalized in 2022, but in essence, she had been managing on her own long before that. Homeschooling, which required daily preparation and lessons, constant care, full responsibility for everything happening in her son's life, all of it rested on her. Work was a third front, where she was also alone. Before taking up trading, Irina worked as a customer support manager at a car dealership. A stable position, a clear schedule, a predictable income. But at some point, she decided she could earn more and went into business for herself. Also alone, without partners, and without a safety net. 3 directions, 3 zones of responsibility, and in each of them, she was the only one who could be counted on. Parents, son, money, and not a single person nearby with whom she could share this load, or even talk about how heavy it was becoming. In her final statement at the trial, Shatova listed everything that was weighing on her during that period. The loss of money on the stock market, pressure from clients, her husband's departure, the betrayal of someone close, health problems, 5 points, each of which is capable of knocking someone off course on its own. And she added a phrase that would later be frequently quoted: "I regret that there were no people around with support and help." From the outside, everything looked completely different. Neighbors saw a calm, composed woman. Parents saw a caring daughter who always arrived when needed. No one around her noticed she was drowning because she gave no signals and did not ask for help. Her father would say at the trial, if she had told them about her problems, if she had mentioned even a word of what was happening. They would have settled everything in one day. They would have found the money, negotiated with creditors, resolved the issue. But she didn't tell them. She was used to managing on her own and apparently believed that admitting she couldn't cope was a sign of weakness. In that same final statement, she uttered another phrase that perhaps explains much of what happened. I was the only one they had left, and for their sake, I must live. Alone was the key word in her entire story. She was alone with all that weight, alone with all the decisions, alone with all the responsibility. And at some point, she simply stopped coping. The investigation began to look into the financial side of the story, and the deeper the investigators dug, the more complex and convoluted the picture became regarding what was happening with the money of Irina Shatova and her clients. The scheme she used worked as follows. She bought shares in various enterprises, waited for them to increase in price, and then sold them at a profit. Classic trading, nothing illegal in the mechanics themselves. But the problem lay in one significant circumstance. She was not trading with her own funds. She took money from investors, acquaintances, friends, relatives of acquaintances, people who entrusted her with their savings under the promise of high interest rates. At first, everything really worked. Payments were made, and clients were satisfied. And then, at some point, something went wrong. The market did not behave as she expected. The deals turned out to be loss-making, and those losses had to be covered somehow. Then she began taking new money from new clients to cover obligations to the old ones. Then more and more. A mechanism that the financial world calls a pyramid scheme. In court, she would name the total amount of her debt as 3 million rubles. Now this was the figure she voiced herself. And according to the investigation, the real scale of the problem turned out to be significantly larger. One of the investors, referred to in the case files as Ivan, contacted journalists after Shatova was arrested. He had invested several million rubles in her business, and for a long time did not suspect any problems. At the end of April, about 2.5 months before that night, Irina called him herself. She said everything was fine with the money. Everything was going according to plan. And she asked to increase the investment amount, to invest more. This seemed strange to Ivan, and he decided to act cautiously. He asked to withdraw his funds, 10 million rubles, along with the interest accumulated during that time. In response, Shatova said her trading account was temporarily blocked, and it would be impossible to withdraw the money right then. He needed to wait a bit. Ivan waited. Then he asked again how things were going, and at some point, Irina finally confessed. Back in March, she had lost all the money. Not a part, not some percentage, everything. And her ex-husband, Sergei, who also participated in this scheme and helped find investors, had already left for the USA by that time. After this confession, Shatova offered to transfer Sergei's promissory note to herself, taking his share of the obligations upon herself. The logic was simple. He had already left. Nothing could be gotten from him. But she was here and would try to pay it back somehow. Ivan agreed to these terms, but the money never returned. When the investigation pulled all the documents, it became clear that Shatova had many clients. The investment amounts varied. Some entrusted her with hundreds of thousands, others with millions. And none of these people knew what was actually happening. everyone believed their money was working and bringing in the promised income. Meanwhile, Shatova continued to keep up appearances. She rented an office in that very hotel, the Žemčužina, met with clients, answered calls, and discussed prospects. Until the very end, she behaved as if everything was under control and no problems existed. The investigation qualified the situation she found herself in as pressure. Colossal pressure from clients, she would later say in her final statement in court. People were calling, demanding their money, waiting for payments, and she already knew there was nothing left to give. During a search of Shatova's apartment, investigators discovered a notebook. Ordinary looking, without a bright cover, completely unremarkable. A personal diary she had kept for a long time. It was seized along with other physical evidence, and when investigators began reading the entries, much of what seemed inexplicable finally fell into place. Later, investigator Gleb Vedernikov would tell journalists, "For me, the key was her diary, which we seized during the search. Not camera footage, not witness testimony, not forensic results. It was this notebook, in which Irina recorded her thoughts. That became the main source of understanding what was going on in her head. She had been keeping the diary for a long time and fairly regularly, though not every day. She wrote down things she didn't say out loud, things she didn't share with her parents or anyone around her. Everything she kept inside ended up on those pages. The entries traced a chronicle of increasing pressure. Financial problems appeared in the diary first as a slight anxiety, then as growing concern, and then as outright panic, attempts to find some way out of the situation. A gradual realization that there might not be a way out anymore. And parallel to this, thoughts about what to do next when everything finally collapsed. The debt was 3 million rubles. The monthly payment for obligations to creditors was 98,000, with a total income of about 100,000 a month. The arithmetic simply didn't add up, and she understood this perfectly. Every subsequent month was a step toward a cliff, and there was no room left to maneuver. She wrote about thinking of ending her journey herself, about a self-willed departure from life, to end it all at once and not prolong the agony any further. But there was one problem that prevented her from doing this: her son. He was too strongly attached to her, and she knew this better than anyone else, because she herself had raised him exactly that way, in that closed world where she was the only center, the only anchor, the only truly close person. A thought appeared in the diary that would later also be heard in her testimony during the investigation. So that he wouldn't be left alone. She couldn't end her journey and leave him, because she understood he wouldn't cope. He wouldn't survive in a world she hadn't prepared him for. And here is what is important to understand. This was not a spontaneous flash, not a momentary breakdown, not a clouding of the mind. The diary entries showed the investigation that she had thought about it in advance. She played out options in her head. She weighed the consequences. She made the decision days, perhaps even weeks, before that night of July 12th. The diary became key evidence, not just of the fact of what happened, but of the presence of intent. The investigation qualified her actions as pre-planned, not a crime of passion, not a temporary mental disturbance, but the cold calculation of a person who had already decided everything for themselves. Shatova knew her life was over, financially, most certainly. And she made the decision to take with her the only person who, in her conviction, could not exist without her. The notebook lay in a desk drawer. No one hid it or tried to destroy it. Perhaps because Irina initially didn't expect that she would be sought, or because by that point, she no longer cared whether those records were found or not. CCTV footage was later reviewed dozens of times. Investigators, psychologists, experts, journalists, everyone who came into contact with this case in one way or another returned to these frames again and again. And everyone was looking for the same thing, at least some emotion on her face, at least some sign that what was happening was affecting her. There was none, nothing. At 01:17, the camera records her walking across a bridge. A suitcase rolls beside her on wheels. She holds the handle and just walks forward. Her pace is steady, neither fast nor slow, the way people usually walk when returning from a long trip. At 01:46, she's already without the suitcase. Her hands are folded behind her back. She takes a leisurely stroll along the embankment as if she had come out to breathe the fresh air on a warm summer night. Her gaze is directed forward. Her face is absolutely still. Not a single muscle twitched the entire time she was in the camera's field of vision. No tears, no darting from side to side, no looking over her shoulder. Not the slightest attempt to quicken her pace, hide in an alley, or even conceal her face from the lenses. She walked through the night city as if nothing special had happened, as if it were an ordinary walk, like hundreds of others in her life. When these recordings hit the internet and ordinary people saw them, the comments were almost unanimous. Cold-blooded, psychopath, inhuman, a monster in human form. People looked at this woman with a stone face and couldn't believe a human could behave like that after what she had done. It seemed to be proof of her total detachment and lack of empathy. But investigator Gleb Vedernikov, who led this case and knew it from the inside better than anyone else, saw something completely different in those frames. According to him, it was not the calmness of a person who is in control of the situation and cold-bloodedly executing a pre-planned scheme. It was the absence of a person as such, an empty shell that mechanically moves through the city streets, performs some actions, moves its legs, turns corners. But inside that shell, there was nothing left. Later, psychiatrists would conduct an evaluation and give their conclusion. Sane, understood what she was doing, realized the consequences of her actions, and was capable of controlling them. From a legal standpoint, she was fully responsible for her actions. But at the same time, the experts noted an important detail. On that night, she had already made the decision about her own end. In her head, everything was finished. The denouement was determined, and she was simply completing the final actions before following her son. A person who has already internally said goodbye to life and is mechanically completing some technical steps does not cry. They do not dash about. They do not look back. They just go where they need to go and do what they planned to do. And so, the surveillance cameras that night did not capture the cold-bloodedness of a defendant, as millions of viewers perceived it. They captured the shattered inner state of a person who had already ceased to exist for themselves long before their physical presence continued to be recorded on the streets of nighttime Perm. March 2025. Perm Regional Court. The case went into proceedings at the end of January. The first hearings began in February. And now the process was entering its final stage. Irina Shatova did not ask for a jury trial and fully admitted her guilt on all counts of the indictment. In the dock, she looked different than in the nighttime camera recordings. Not a stone face, but an extinguished one, like a person from whom all energy had gone. When the judge asked formal questions, she answered in monosyllables, without emotion, but also without that mechanical emptiness that everyone remembered from the July footage. "Do you have any minor members of your family?" the judge clarified at one of the first hearings. "There was one," she replied. Her parents were present in the courtroom. Her father, a former traffic police lieutenant colonel who had served in the force his entire life. Her mother, the same one Irina had nursed after surgeries. They had come to look at their daughter, who had caused irreparable consequences for their grandson. When the judge began questioning the father as a witness, Irina burst into tears. These were the first tears anyone had seen since her detention last summer. The father of the younger family member, Shatova's ex-husband Sergei, did not attend the hearings. After the divorce, he had moved to the USA, and the investigation had no direct contact with him. It is not known for certain if he knew what had happened or why he didn't return. The courtroom waited for answers. Why? How could she? What drove her to this decision? The version involving outside interference, which was heard at the very beginning, fell apart during the first interrogations. Too many inconsistencies, too many details that contradicted it. Now Shatova had to tell the court the truth about what happened and what led to it. At the trial, she gave testimony. Her voice was steady, almost without intonation, as if she were talking about events that had no direct relation to her. She spoke about a decision that had been forming long before that night. She wanted to end her journey herself, to stop everything at once, not to drag it on any longer. But there was her son. She couldn't leave him, not because it was a pity or because she was afraid to part with him. In her perception, he wouldn't be able to exist without her, without the only person to whom he was truly attached, without support, without the skills to live in a world she hadn't prepared him for. In her logic, it looked like this. She leaves, and he remains alone in the system that destroyed her, with debts, with problems, without a future. She didn't want such a life for him. Therefore, she decided to take him with her. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't a desire to cause suffering. In her distorted logic, it looked like protection, like deliverance from future consequences. She spoke about attachment, about care, about the impossibility of leaving him alone. The courtroom listened in silence. This wasn't an excuse. It was an explanation, internally logical, for a person who no longer saw other options. In court, a figure was mentioned that clarified much. 62 million rubles. That was the total amount of Irina Shatova's debt by July 2024. The investigation reconstructed the financial chain. The first operations, attempts to win back losses, new borrowings to cover old obligations, a spiral from which almost no one escapes. By the spring of 2024, the situation had become irreversible. Clients' funds had vanished. Her own savings too. The pressure intensified every day. She saw no way out. Formal procedures seemed to her like destruction. There was nowhere to go. And she made the decision about the finale. But there was her son. Leaving him meant, in her perception, abandoning him alone in a world she considered hostile and destructive. Therefore, she made the decision to take him with her. On March 18, 2025, the court announced the verdict: 18 years of imprisonment in a general regime colony. Irina Shatova listened to it in silence. She wanted to leave together with her son. Only he left.